Merhaba arkadaşlar.
Hello everyone. In a half an hour, I hope the interpreters will not complain. I need to be very quick because I have limited time. I will be talking about the milestones of the Izmir Armenian media. Before we come to the Izmir media, because we do not have much information showing that there are Armenians living in Izmir. We had this information that there is an Armenian neighborhood with the occurrence of the fire. So in relation to the history of Armenians and the milestones, let me give you a couple of dates. First is 301. Armenians converted to Christianism. Another breaking point is this is similar dates, similar milestones exist in all nations' history, and 412 is the invention of the Armenian alphabet. And it started to be used in 412. We need to keep that in mind. And another breaking point is between 412 and 1512. This is the handwritings period. It's an unbelievably rich period for the history of humanity. And in 1512, we have the publication of the first Armenian book. Around 50 years later, Gutenberg. And 1794, we have the publication of the first Armenian newspaper. These are the Armenian letters. We have 36 letters. So in 412, we have 34 letters, and 2 were added later. Aziz Mesrop and Subzak did this invention, and this alphabet has not changed and remained the same. It's a phonetical language. It's an Indian European belongs to Indian European language family, and it is read as it's written. This is the manuscript era, as I said. Handwritings era. This is an incredibly rich accumulation for the human history, not only for the Armenian history, for the religion and education of Armenians, but this is also important for all different ethnicities, groups. We have manuscripts on those. So from that date till today, we have around 40,000 manuscripts existent, relevant to different cultures and nations. The first Armenian book was published in not in Anatolia, but it was published in Venice in 4 books. Similarly, in 1794, the first newspaper was printed in India, Madras city. The name was Astarar. I will present you 2 maps. One is a map of the world, and there you see some figures on the map. The first one is India. The first book was printed in there. What does this mean? The last figure shows 42. So in 42 different countries of the world, Armenian books, newspapers were printed, publishing houses were established. Another map shows the today's Republican borders. I'm not talking about Ottoman period. So in 41 cities, 625 publications were made. And today's correspondence to that figure is only 3. Let's focus on Izmir, because we are talking about Izmir. Periodicals in Armenian, like newspapers, magazines, journals, We have a 45,000 page archive between 1840 with the first newspapers publishment and between 1922. I have been through the whole collection. Almost all of the collection has been digitized, and this is on Izmir only. You can have a different one for Istanbul, Trabzon, Diyarbakir. So this is so rich, this history. As I said, there are 16 newspapers and magazines printed in Izmir in Armenian. These are different categories. I will just mention them very shortly. This has played such an important role in the intellectuals of Izmir. They called Izmir as the Athens of Armenian. In many fictions in the history is named as the Armenian Athens. Another turning point for Armenians is that Veradzinund and Renaissance of Armenians. This is an enlightenment period, and in that period the intellectuals of Armenians, Izmir Armenians and publications of Izmir plays a great role. Where can we compare this? We compare it to the Izmir. So Izmir has a second role after Istanbul. The first newspaper in Izmir is called as the storage of useful information. It's a missionary newspaper. In 1830s, missionaries, American missionaries, were settling down in the coastal cities of Ottoman Empire and were trying to convert Muslims into Christianism, but unfortunately they were not very successful, especially the American Protestant missionary organizations. So they looked at the Armenians to convert them to Protestantism. So these institutions in many places of Anatolia established schools, hospitals, orphanages, and similarly they started a newspaper in Izmir. The newspaper technology is very high at that period. When you look at the other newspapers, this İştemeran Bidaniki Dalyats, the printing technology, the quality of the paper is very high because the missionary establishments have no economic restrictions. They receive the funding and everything, machinery, technology from the states, and these technology and these printing houses produce very high quality printings, and they distribute the newspapers free of charge. They do not sell it. And from different countries of the world, they do not have politics in this newspaper. From India to Petersburg, from different countries of Europe, they share useful information. And as you see here, towards 1850s, the activity is terminated and the newspaper is moved to Istanbul and carries on activity in Istanbul. And the name is now Aridopen. When we say Izmir and intellectuals of Izmir and the journalists and publishers of Izmir, let me summarize something about them, because we will see many portraits like this. Armenian intellectuals, journalists, teachers, artists, musicians in Izmir were people who went to Europe for education, especially to Vienna, to Paris for education, but they have received their education, and also they took part in the political activities in those countries. Some of them were put in prison because of their participation, and then they settled in Izmir, Sivas and other cities of Turkey and carried on their activity. They may act as teachers or publishers. Sklap Vorsanyan was one of them. He went to Paris for education purposes, but he was on the buffer zone Paris. He was imprisoned, and after completing his education came to Istanbul, and from Istanbul he moved to Izmir. One of the most important publications in Izmir is the Dawn of Ararat. It has a very influential publication policy led by Arşalus Araradian. One of the panelists mentioned that newspaper in her speech. In order to understand the influence of that newspaper, let me share with you an announcement from that newspaper. There's an explanation. A price is explained. This is not important. What is important here is that if you find this newspaper in Istanbul, Tbilisi, Tiflis, Baghdad, Calcutta, Indonesia, you can find that newspaper in those different cities of the world. So it has such a clientele around the world. This is not only the audience, those who read the newspaper, but they have news on these cities. So this is the last page, providing economical news. Stock exchange news is given there. Cotton, wool prices. This is like stock exchange in London, Marseille. So on daily basis, they provide information on those. So there are other areas they give periodical information. They translate foreign literature. Another newspaper is The Patriot, Hayren Eser. Again, it's an important publication. Izmir newspapers attach great importance to education. They have special pages allocated to education and pedagogy. And they whatever improvement is made in education, pedagogy, they provide that information. They share this information. And let me share this. This is a world map made in Venice in 1695. I think this helps us to have an image of what we have been talking about so far. So this points out to that Armenian merchants, Armenian media world, Armenian commercial people, and without their support this was not possible. They both economically and morally provided this support to Armenian media, not only to the newspapers but to the books, to translation. So they had great contribution. And as you see, there are foreign news from England, Netherlands, from all the countries that you can name at that time. Political, economic developments of those countries at that time were mentioned in the pages of the newspapers. And also Harutun Dedeyan and his printing house should be mentioned when we say Izmir. He is a famous person. I have a book on Smyrnian Armenians. You can read about him in a more detailed fashion in that book if you like. Even if you write the names in the internet, you will find detailed information. I mentioned that there was a magazine called Dawn of Ararat, and Hartun and Garabet Dedeyan brothers published it. And this Smyrnian Enlightenment movement received their contribution, and world classics were translated by them and published by them in Armenian, not into Turkish but to Armenian. This is another map that I'd like to present to you. We have been talking about this, the schooling issue. This Aydın province, at that time, Aydın is the province, and there are 27 Armenian schools in that province. And in those Armenian schools, in İzmir province, in the area that we are located, there are 13 schools. And there are 1,640 male, 1,295 female students. These are the figures from the patriarch. These are official figures. And there's an important school, Mesropyan School. Those who went to Europe for education and follow everything in relation to pedagogy. They're working in this Mesropyan School for boys, and not from İzmir, from Istanbul, from Caucasus, and other parts, students coming to that school. And the reason for they prefer the schools, they have a very developed science lab, and they also have a newspaper. They publish a newspaper.
Because this school, students of this school had a printing facility, and graduates of this school would publish 3 newspapers and magazines in İzmir, and one of them is the Tudak Hagyazyan. You see, it doesn't have a quite professional layout, but still these were students, and these students were authorized, and they were given printing machines as a gift, and they were using these old printing machines, and they would print the first magazine. And the second publication of this school is Yergeser, so art lover, and the same students printed this, published this. So these publications did not last for decades, and they were published probably for 2 years, 3 years, and some of them lasted for 50 years, 60 years. And the last magazine is the Mutual Society, and this did not last for too long because there was censorship back then. It was then forbidden. This society magazine was forbidden. And when we look at the İzmir publication history, we always associate it with Mamurian and Hrant, his son Hrant. And both of them, father and son, father started this. Mateusz Mamurian started this. And they published many newspapers in Istanbul and İzmir. And then his son took over. And this is a very large literature. There are many books printed in their printing house, and newspapers were printed also in the Mamurian printing house. And this is his son. And the most important newspaper that they have published was titled Zagik. It meant flower. And so this there were discussions between the conservatives and the progress supporters. There were discussions between them, and there were Armenian merchants, and these merchants were intellectuals, although they were merchants, and with their financial support and psychological support, they continued with these publications. Zagik had different versions. It was printed weekly, daily, monthly, sometimes with pictures, sometimes without pictures. So this is a different type of. And there's another newspaper. It is titled Haber Jahars. It is the goddess of eternal life, and you see the engraving here, engraving of İzmir. And this publication was in the area of literature and art. And so between 1871 and 1922, there was a magazine which was published in İzmir for almost 50 years. So this magazine was published for 50 years. Arevelian Mamur, this was the name of this publication. Mateusz Mamurian. So he printed this, he published this. This was an extraordinary publication in terms of its contents and also in terms of its printing quality. and in terms of its popularity, there are different versions. There was a weekly, daily, monthly, and the most popular version was the following. You see there's a printing machine there, and you see a person sitting in front of this printing machine, and he's looking at Gutenberg here. After a certain time, this Gutenberg was replaced with the picture of Father Matthäus and Meteora. And there was a short-termed magazine. Unfortunately, Ottoman censor has prohibited the publication of this magazine. And Hayganush Mark, maybe you have heard this. He was born in Istanbul, and she studied on female problems, and during the Ottoman period she was the first feminist writer, so I think it's possible to say that, and Hagen Ermenica. So she wrote for 4 or 5 years, and women labor, women liberalization, relationships between women and females and males, and there were also news from the global feminist movements. There were meetings with the global feminist movements. So this was the publication she made in Istanbul. And when invited by the clergy in Izmir, she also came here, and she published a newspaper called Arshalius. It meant dawn, and she published it together with her husband. And this Arshalius mainly focused on the women problems, issues. And there's also a publication which is called Taşink. It means contract, and it covers the educational life and literature world of the Armenians living in Izmir. And on the last page you see advertisements and news, and generally in many of the last paper of the newspapers, this is allocated to advertisements and commercial news. And when you look at the last papers of these newspapers, you can see signs of the economic life and organizations in Izmir. So you can see news about agriculture, the export items, the import items. You can see everything, you can find everything on the last page of these newspapers. And there's also a newspaper which was published for a short period of time. It was called İzmirli. So, and also when we talk about the media world, and we should also discuss the humor section. And so İzmir Armenian press world also had a humor page, Müredik. And there was also Ashkadank. It means labor, and it has a political content. And Haykragan Nutyun. So this publication was about Armenian literature in Izmir. So famous Armenian poets, famous Armenian storytellers and authors, novelists. So many famous Armenian authors wrote here. So Kınar, it means fire. And so this was about literature and music. So this didn't last long, but still they published this. And Adrushan, altar. And so it makes references to the multi-deity period. So it is about fine arts and literature. Maybe you don't see there, but this is a map of Turkey, and there's a red dot here. Maybe you can not see it. So this is the running man figure. And so wherever there is a red mark, there is an Armenian sports organization, as we have told earlier, in Izmir and in Istanbul. Just like Greeks, Armenians had sports clubs, and the objectives were the same. The organizations came together with the same purpose. When we look at the Armenian sports clubs in Izmir, you see that they there are many similarities between them, and another similarity is the following. And scouting activity for both Greeks and Armenians. We see that scouting activity was very important for both communities in the Balkans and also in this region, and also in Greece. Scouting activities were quite famous, and scouting organizations were quite prominent, and also military training was provided. When I mean military training, I mean the following: training with weapons, using the weapon, putting ammunition, and pulling the trigger. So this was not a preparation for a rebel. It was just like the Greeks. Armenians had this military training, and Armenians published a newspaper called Badras. Be prepared, be ready. And mostly this was focused on scouting activities. And also in Aydın province, you see the churches, Armenian churches in the Aydın province. And in Izmir, here in Izmir, I do not take into account other cities of the province. There are 22, but there are 14 Armenian churches. There were 14 Armenian churches in Izmir, and the most important church was the Surp Istapanos church in the fair area. So this was the Armenian Religious Pioneership Center. It was responsible for the direction and guidance of all the education and other social operations of the Armenian community, but it had also another function. Most of the Balkan countries were reporting to this center. So İzmir center was responsible for the administration of other clergies in other countries. So Tapni, Tree of Laurel. So this was a magazine which was published by the clergy, Armenian clergy, and this is the last Armenian newspapers. And after this one, it's not possible to see another newspaper published in Armenian language in Izmir. And when we talk about publication, of course, there is always censorship. And so what about Izmir? Was there any censorship imposed on magazines and newspapers published in Armenian language in Izmir?
Of course, it was not as intensive as it was in Istanbul, but some newspapers and magazines were also banned. And the most important of those is Arevelian Mamul. It is the press of East. So it was banned. And there was this law on censorship, and there was a special article on that, very interesting article actually. At every birthday of Abdülhamid and his anniversary of coming to the force, every newspaper had to make a celebration announcement. If you do not do that, your newspaper would be closed for a certain period of time, and some of them were banned. And that's why when we look at the Armenian newspapers and magazines, we see these type of problems. We see these kind of admirative writings occurring in these newspapers and magazines, and some annexes are also printed by some of those newspapers. Why they do not add a page, but they present it as an annex? This is also relevant to the law on censorship. In the law, the annexes are not mentioned. So Armenians found that gap. So things that we cannot include into the newspaper, they use those annexes. So in order to write their criticisms to the government, to the ministries or the massacres in Anatolia or other places, of course, the government added that into the censorship law. So all the annexes are also subject to the censorship. So before the printing, they need to be delivered to the censor board. I guess that our time is up, but there are printing houses, Armenian printing houses in Izmir. I would like to give a couple of examples. The first book of Izmir was printed in 1663 by the Armenian printing house, publishing house, and this is the book that we see here as the first book. The first books have religious content. Some examples from those books from 1762-61, and we see books on education and pedagogy. And also, Izmir is called as the school for translators, this media world of Izmir. So these intellectuals, those journalists, artists, writers, they are intellectuals, and they take the classicals from Europe, and they take those and translate them into Armenian language and publish them in those printing houses. This is an important collection. Nubaryan is one of them. In the Armenian media world of Izmir, there are Armenian alphabet using Turkish printings. The alphabet looks like Armenian, but when you read it out loud, it sounds Turkish. When you read it. So in many different points, astrology, physics, chemistry, in the early periods, we see these kind of books. And there is a special printing house that I would like to conclude with. This is Tatigyan Print House, very important one, and famous engraving artist and graphicer at the technology of that time. And they do colored printing in Izmir. And another characteristic of Tatigyan printing, in whichever language they want, they did the printing in that language. In English, French, German, Ottoman, Ladino, whichever language you want, they made the printing. For instance, this is a product of Tatigyan print house. This is not a picture, and this was for commercial purposes. And they also printed the portraits of the sultans. They sometimes sold it one by one or in whole, and posts of Izmir to newspapers by the same print house. And we have the print house of the Dedeyan brothers, some examples from their print house, Goethe's Werther and Victor Hugo's
baskı yapmıştır bu Ermence tercüme. Yine William Shakespeare'in Romeo ve Juliet adlı eseri tercüme edilerek basılmış. Aklımıza hangi konular geliyorsa bütün bunlardan, örneğin Monte Cristo kontu, Amori gibi oldukça fazla sayıda. Teşekkür.